Okay, here we go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this. I think this is one of our first evening events. It's given us an excuse to have a glass of wine, or some of us before we start. So what we're here is we are here today with Rhiannon and John to talk about. You know, it's not really impressive when you're holding a printout rather than an actual.
Do you want to hold the book?
Oh, I will hold the book. Gotta hold the book.
Post-its.
I can't one without post-its.
This book, this very, very lovely book, which has a nice ominous robot on the front cover. Because all books about cybernetics need to have ominous robots.
They do. Yeah.
And the more ominous the robot, the better the book.
Really?
I think it's
the rule of cybernetics.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about Rhiannon and John's new book, Utopia in the Factory: Prefigurative Knowledge Against Capitalism. And I, in a rare moment of being over-organized, wrote far too many freaking questions.
They're great questions. I don't know if I can answer them. We got sent them a few hours ago, so we'll do our best.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is we'll start with a few of them, see how it goes, and then at a certain point, the audience will overthrow me, and you will start running the conversation, and I will just sort of wander off into the night, and it will be great. So a book about Utopia and cybernetics. I understand why you're talking about cybernetics, but talking about Utopia at the moment feels a little bit strange. So maybe as a point to start it about this book, how did you get here? What's the sort of give me the elevator pitch of the movie version. What's the what's the sort of main theme we got going on here?
You want me to start?
You start, please. Yeah.
I suppose it might make more sense if we talk about the conditions of production of the book, which was that John was involved in a large grant, which was with the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, which is not who we'd usually expect to fund our work as sociologists. And it was a multi-university team with people who were designers and data scientists and robotics people. So they were all sort of STEM people who weren't in the least bit interested in being critical about what they did. They just wanted to they were a bit actually.
They were interested a bit in what we did, I think, when they found out what we did.
They were. They thought it was quite cool actually, but in general they wanted to just use the money to, do the thing they were interested in, and then I suppose that's exactly what we wanted to do as well. So it was quite hard for us to communicate as a team, and we were obviously critical sociologists, so we're looking at some of the problems with the technologies that they were sort of working within, that was within their expertise. So it did make some interesting conversations and some difficult meetings where we didn't all understand each other, but they were very, very nice people and we all got along very well. But I think it was quite difficult for us to find our place within that project in a way. But we were able to write what we were interested in, which was critiquing the idea that the project was based on, which was strangely enough originally John's idea in the first place. So you should probably say about what that was.
The project was called Chatty Factories. So it was an EPSRC sandpit. So on these sandpits, the funding councils pay for lots of people to go away for a week and stay in a hotel, which is really nice, and to come up with a joint interdisciplinary project. And the idea was the factories were going to be kind of a bit like Disneyfied, where every object was in communication with every other object. So I suppose it's following the Internet of Things, or the real Internet of Things, where I can't remember what that's called, but everything has communication with every other entity. And the STEM people like that idea, and I thought it'd be quite interesting to critique the hell out of, or at least look at in a kind of sociological way. But it
was an odd premise. It was kind of like a utopian extrapolation of trends from the present that we are probably not sympathetic towards, and thinking what that might look in perhaps even a dystopian future.
So kind of they were imagining the animated version of Beauty and the Beast, where the candlestick is talking to the teapot.
Absolutely. So it's commodity fetishism gone wild, to be honest. So that was the basis of. That wasn't really the basis of the project. The project was called Chatty Factories, looking at what factories would be like in 2030, and there were a few projects around it. But yeah, so we're working with these other people, but we got a chance to go to some real life factories and workplaces, which was really interesting to sociologists, because I think that the 70s and 80s there were a lot of sociological studies in factories, and Ford had a sociology department like in the 1920s or even earlier, but I don't think sociologists go to factories as much as they
Not
used
that
to.
I
And certainly
know
there
of.
doesn't seem to be many popular sociological works in factories, so that was quite interesting to do, and that was part of the project.
And you have a few different sites where you have, okay, now I'm going to see if I remember correctly. You have like a more mainstream factory engineering firm. Then you have a more a cooperatively run sort of high-end customized factory. Then you have then there's the Hack Lab.
Hackspace.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hackspace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was we called it Cyber 4.0. It's actually a really big UK manufacturing firm. We had to sign an NDA, and they actually read the chapter. So I can't say too much about what they do, but it was an enormous gigafactory in the UK that's miles big, huge production lines, and they were
Really
into the idea of. Go on.
Yeah, they're really at the forefront of sort of experimenting with automotive technology, I suppose. So, they invested in research and stuff like that as well, in terms of like automation on the factory floor.
And it was a very big Industry 4.0 place, so they wanted everything to be mechanised and put into a huge cybernetic system in a mainstream way. So there was that. Then there was Isthmus, wasn't there? So.
Yeah, and then there was a cooperative in Wisconsin, USA, which produces custom automation solutions. So rather than using automation to automate their own work, which they very much didn't do, they did like sort of bespoke artisanal like basically one-off pieces, which the workers were very passionate about and very much saw them as a kind of product of their creative labour, and so they weren't automating their processes, but they were producing automation solutions for other businesses to automate their processes, which was quite interesting, talking to workers about how they felt as a cooperative, and they were very invested in the kind of democratic egalitarian ethos of the co-op, and how they felt about the fact that their supply chain was basically sending these automation things to other factories, which could potentially, I suppose, put other workers out of work. So and they were all quite aware of that and had some interesting takes on that. So that's one of the interesting aspects of that chapter, I suppose.
And then the most grassroots was the Hackspace, which was a lab where people came and could design whatever they wanted. You went there, didn't you?
Yeah. So they've got about 2,000 people on their mailing list, but when I went there, they'd just moved sites, and I think some people weren't that active. But basically, they had like quite active automation groups, and in the end, I only spoke to 3 people who were involved in what they self-defined as automation, but as hobbyists. So they were using automation in a creative way as a hobby, basically.
It's interesting because you have 3 very different sites there, where we have one which goes perhaps the most traditionally business focused and much more standardized, to a more like high-end customizable version of using automation, to a very much kind of a hobbyist angle. And I think that really sort of encapsulates like your overall argument, which to me seems about like trying to probe what are the limits of cybernetics and what cybernetics can't do, what it can't capture, what it can account for. Would that be a fair rendering?
Yeah, I think some of it emerged from the data. So this concept of hobbying emerged very much from the data, where we saw even in the really traditional factory that people would have what we called hobbies, because they were very whimsical, ad hoc, not top down, just little projects that people would decide to do. Even people on the the production line. So one guy, there were two robots, and the manufacturer said they couldn't work together to paint a vehicle, and the firm said they couldn't work together, it was impossible. But just by tinkering and messing around with them, he got them to work together to paint together. So that's something that wouldn't have been possible. Of course, the company could recoup, the profitability of that, but nevertheless, it was kind of a little hobby. And the other concept was tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that can't be. I mean, that's a common concept in sociology and business, I suppose. That knowledge that can't be encoded or captured any other way. So things like the sound of the production press on the production line, people could tell if something was going to go wrong purely by the sound and the physical sensation of it in the factory. So these two concepts, hobbying and tacit knowledge, we claim cannot be recouped by cybernetic systems, but there's more to the argument than that. I mean,
it can't be mapped or automated, so it can be profit. It can be recouped for profit, because that's what capitalists will do. Yeah. But we sort of see them as things that humans can do that you won't be able to.
Systems can't.
Yeah.
In a way, the example of the sort of higher end factory doing custom automation reminds me a bit of, let's say, like your higher end Google engineers who get their like 15% of like free time to flexibly do whatever they want, and thus they devise new ideas then. So it's kind of like the more cutting edge experimental edge of capital, where they come up with ideas that then get brought back into production.
Yeah.
I mean, the cooperative was very much a cooperative, and they were really inspired by the cooperative principles, and they had them sort of in huge letters on their wall, and they very much cared about everyone having an equal say in everything in the factory, and sort of, critiquing informal hierarchies, and they were also sort of active in the local town. They had this like Wisconsin town. Wisconsin's got loads of cooperatives. I didn't really expect that, but even the cab drivers have driven Uber out of town, and they've got their own sort of algorithm run badger cabs or whatever it's called that that is a cooperative basically. So there's I think there's a danger in kind of theorizing about these kinds of projects which need to exist within capitalism, of kind of critiquing them for not being an ideal communist thing or something, and like I wouldn't want to do that, but certainly there were ways in which they replicated kind of capitalist or cybernetic ideology and what they did, but they were also quite conscious and critical of that themselves.
But the replication was never complete. I think the whimsical nature of hobbying means that people can do things, ad hoc things, that a cybernetic model could not hope to capture, or might even be against the interests of the people who decide to put together that system, which is why we find the cybernetic paradigm for politics quite problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of where this sort of idea of critiquing cybernetics came from is that we noticed a lot of books from radical paradigms like anarchists and sort of communists or leftists or socialists sort of trying to revive cybernetics, I guess, because it was a sort of big discourse in the 60s and 70s, I guess, and it seems to have sort of fallen out of public discourse, but it certainly seems to be alive and well in the sense that it's a management technique or whatever, or it's a technocratic system.
And it's come back from capital as well, isn't it? I think that is it the guy who runs Google is opening up a cybernetic institute in Oxford or something? He's bought a pub and is regenerating it into an institute for cybernetics. So it seems to be all over, both right discourse, capitalist discourse, and leftist discourse. And anarchist cybernetics was the Thomas Swan stuff, which we read, and things of that nature. So.
I mean, historically, there's a very interesting thing about the history of cybernetics, where you have several ideas are of interest to people in the military and weird techno hippies and cooperatives, and you go, how do all these people have interest in they're seeing different things in it, but
yeah, I mean, it's the same with the internet in the early days of the internet, really, isn't it? I suppose, and it's I guess there's a kind of technological optimism on both the right and the left, and I suppose that's more what we critique more generally is technological optimism rather than just cybernetics.
Yes.
And that, I suppose that's why you said why Utopia. I mean, Utopia is my research interest, so I've written about all sorts of different utopias, and people often don't really understand what utopia means, but it's kind of sort of future-facing desire, or some, it can mean different things. It can mean people can be sort of critical utopians who set up kind of democratic projects in the present, and I suppose cooperatives could be seen as a kind of critical utopia, but then there's also very much top-down or technocratic utopias which sort of design, that they sort of institute the desires of an elite, I suppose, by
and
through planning often.
Yeah, and cybernetics tries to have the best of both worlds, doesn't it? So it's a technology for constructing a society or a social system, as well as being a sort of bottom-up, organic. It seems to be the best of both worlds, but yeah, we are against that. And of course, the factory as well, we argue, has been historically used as site utopia, utopian socialists. Marx, the factory was where workers would come together. But it's also been used by people like Elon Musk as being, he slept in his factory, didn't he, and loved seeing the process in Tesla, as well as, fascists. So Hitler saw the factory as being where people came together in a kind of folk interest. But the one blind spot in our book actually is in terms of the factory as a site of class struggle. We don't really look at that, and I think that was part of maybe one of the constraints of the funding. That wasn't something that we could. It came out sometimes, didn't it? But in terms of struggle between workers and managers, particularly in the Cyber 4.0, but I'd say that's probably a blind spot of our.
Yeah, because they wanted to okay the interview schedule before we did it, and it was interesting because even the manager there was a member of the union and said they were very unionised, but they didn't want us to talk about that.
No.
I think so.
Interesting. No, what I was saying about Utopia being weird was talking about Utopia in the current moment feels a bit weird because the present to me doesn't feel very utopian. And I guess one of the reasons why you might feel a bit uneasy talking about Utopia in the factory is because oftentimes one of the critiques of Utopia is the visions which are too totalized, which involve too much pre-planned, and have no room for the messy, the improvised, the sort of like the thing that isn't planned out in advance. Basically, they have no room for tacit knowledge, basically.
So one real problem of cybernetics is because of its iconography, may I say, appears to be messy. So it's these nice, cloud diagrams and things, and looks like a cell and looks like an organic system. But when you get below the surface of that, I think, Thomas Swan is a bit guilty of this. It's a great book, Cybernetic Anarchism, but here's these kind of diagrams, but actually he doesn't give the underlying cybernetic circuitry of the what a cybernetic system actually looks like with a signal and these sorts of things. So I suppose it's an extrapolation of what cybernetics is, and maybe it can be used as a metaphor, but
I mean, one bit where I'm going to say I'm a little bit critical of your take is maybe because you're talking about one of my former PhD students, so I have to defend.
James is actually a good friend of mine, and we're co-authoring a paper at the moment. So,
but what you do is interesting, where you say something, basically sort of summarize a bunch of his arguments, and then say, okay, when he attends to the messy, the unplanned, all of these things are very good and very close to what we're talking about, but that's just not cybernetics. And to me, it seems like you're doing this thing where I think you actually come up with an argument which is fairly close to James's work, but then you see what he's doing is basically being outside of cybernetics rather than inside it.
yeah.
And what I think is interesting about his work, where the example he used were all projects of the cola place. But they're all projects for people who are you here, James? They're all projects for people who did. Oh.
Hi James.
Hey, James.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, my audio wasn't working about
Hello.
No. So they're all projects from people who think of their work as being inside cybernetics. So rather than just saying I think you're wrong, because that would be a more discussion, I'm more concerned about what for you are the stakes of drawing a line where those things that James talks about are not in cybernetics, rather than being a part of it. Does that make sense? Was a question like why is that boundary? Like, what does that boundary do for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger in radical people taking on cybernetics. So I think that the people that James is looking at probably think they're doing cybernetics and they're probably trying to do cybernetics, but maybe that's de-radicalising them in a sense, and the more radical things that they're doing are the things that can't be captured by cybernetics.
Cybernetic itself tries to be a totalising discourse, that anything can be brought into a cybernetic system or a cybernetic discussion, but we would argue there are elements of sociality that actually aren't cybernetic at all. So, for example, if people decide to let's say there's a cybernetic system we talk about where people are producing bread, and then someone decides one day they're not going to produce bread, they're going to produce bread models of ducks and sell them on a lake, and what the kind of exit strategy would be for the
bread models of ducks.
Yeah. Well,
okay,
it's another analogy, but
I needed this. I like
This is in the book.
This is in the book. And just decides to do that. It's just totally idiosyncratic. It's just a thing they decide to do. Now, would the cybernetic system, or if it's anarchist cybernetic society, decide to exit that person? Would they be seen as crazy, or what would they seem to be just to do something idiosyncratic? Now, you could bring that into cybernetics and say, well, that's VSM5 or something, but still, it's an attempt to totalise any aspect of behaviour and either bring it into the system or exit the behaviour from the system. So I would say that's a hard limit. The hard limit for cybernetics is someone who behaves in what could be a non-cybernetic way as decided by the people who set up the system.
And also it treats people as functional nodes in a system. So they're like, in a way, needs and desires are subordinated to the system, and the system might be decided democratically by them, but a week later, they might want to make a duck out of bread, but also it doesn't really account for like unconscious needs and desires. It's got this very kind of behavioural view of the person as being outwardly directed and fulfilling a function within a system, rather than, for example, a psychoanalytic approach which wouldn't see humans in such simple terms, I suppose. And I suppose part of what we're talking about with tacit knowledge and hobbying as forms of knowledge that transgress that system is that I suppose humans are more than just their function in a system. And perhaps the most important part of what it is to be human is something that can't be mapped by cybernetics.
So let me ask, and James, if you want to jump in, just start yelling and okay. Thinking about kinds of tacit knowledge, the idiosyncratic practices, particularly coming out of the cooperative example or the hack lab. Can you think of a way in which there could be coordination between different people in an organization that wouldn't be top down and wouldn't be totalizing? Or does any discussion about organization and connecting things up inherently lead to systemization in a negative sense for you?
So I think when I think about this, one of my favourite sort of piece of anthropology is by someone called Nurit David, who talks about like oil and water sociology, and it talks about human relationships as something that sort of transcends individuals. So when two people are together, they become sort of one. You know how when you put oil in water, it sort of globs together and separates and stuff. I think that's the analogy anyway. And it's kind of a different image of human relationships to what a cybernetic system would be, that they'd be sort of two nodes that would be communicating, but they remain distinct individual nodes and they have to continue to fulfill the same role, I suppose. Or even if they come together as two people, they have a functional role that, doesn't transcend that, whatever that node is defined as. Whereas to me, what's important about sort of human learning, human relationships, and so on, and human-animal relationships as well, because you could treat an animal as a node in a human system, I suppose, but it wouldn't tell you much about that animal's needs and desires and so on. You'd have to train it and domesticate it to fulfil that role as a node in a cybernetic system.
And I think of course people can organise themselves cybernetically, and you could see an anarchist group deciding to organise themselves cybernetically, but does it prefigure the sort of human freedom which one would want in perpetuity for that society? Because individuals would have to have I suppose, a right of exit. I mean, Thomas Mann talks about this from a cybernetic, but then the argument almost peters out, like, okay, what if everyone desires an exit from a cybernetic way of life? Then what does that lead? Well, you could call that another cybernetic system, but then you're just classifying everything as cybernetic.
And I suppose also it requires a degree of expertise to kind of oversee whether something, you know, if you're going to institute a cybernetic system, you have to know what a cybernetic system is. You have to understand the different models and whatever, however you're doing it. So it sort of requires a layer of technocrats, I suppose, or everyone needs to learn what a cybernetic system is.
It does, and there's the idea that people could take turns being the different
overseer.
VSM positions for a period of time, but we know how that turns out, right? Or it could turn out. So, you know, if you're at the top of the cybernetic system, you might be quite comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think James's argument as well is that people can be in both. They can do both, so that, you know, they can have a meeting where they're doing one of the VSM things and then, you know, they're doing their activities, which is separate. Is that, Steve, James is here, is that a fair portrayal of your argument there, James?
Hey, hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yes?
Hi, sorry I couldn't be there. Yeah, so like in the viable systems model, there's like these 5 different parts of the model, and system 1 is like the people who actually doing stuff, like the people on the factory floor or whatever. And system 5 could be very simplistically the kind of like the policy and the governance of the organisation. So there's a seeming kind of hierarchy. You could read that as hierarchical in some way, but in Swan's reading and in John Walker's reading and in the sort of cooperativist and anarchist readings of the Bible systems model, like system 5 would just be like the general committee or something which would involve everyone. So you can, be on the factory floor 1 minute and then, you know, go into an office and have a general meeting and everyone is part of the policy decisions. So it's not necessarily like you take it in terms of being a leader or something, it's just while doing different parts of running the organisation, you're kind of occupying different parts of the model, if that makes sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less what I thought, but you expressed it a lot more clearly than I would.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James.
No, I guess why I asked about that is because I will admit that I'm not a card-carrying cybernetician, and I'm not sure where you would apply to get a card to carry one, anyways. But
Cybernetics Institute.
Probably. But I guess my interest in this is more thinking about coming, you know, from a history of anarchist organizing, where one of the biggest questions is, if you're against top-down organizing, what are you going to do instead, buddy? And then so you want to look for models of organizing which don't operate on principles of top-down hierarchy. Now, I totally understand why cybernetics in many versions operates as a sort of totalizing vision, and we have many examples of bad accelerationist utopias going around right now. I guess my thought is it possible to get something out of those, or is it just completely irredeemable? And one thing I'll add on that to give you an example that might seem counterintuitive is I really like when I'm reading about the history of Project Cybersyn, when they actually they take it apart, even though it was never fully built, right? But they take it apart and they almost like take out a certain technology, the telex machines that they're using for communication back and forth, and use those outside of the system. So they're deliberately breaking in and still using part of it, even though it's no longer within a socialist framework or whatever. I guess yeah, I'm still thinking about like, are there things that can be broken, even if you don't like, totalizing things? Is there anything worth holding on to, or is it like, this is all crap?
Well, there's certain features of societies, spontaneous societies, that can't be articulated in a cybernetic way. I mean, so if you talk about primitivism, for example, that's probably the antithesis of cybernetics. So to have people to set up their own ideas of what a society could look like, it's only a certain kind of path-dependent way of thinking that would produce a cybernetic system. But can parts of it be redeemed? I don't know what those parts would be, because when you break it down, it seems to be the sort of syndicalism, cooperative principles that would apply generally that aren't specifically cybernetic. So is there anything specific about cybernetics that would add to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I sort of, if it's a kind of, I don't understand what it does for anarchism in a way. I can see what anarchism does for cybernetics in that, it can make a more egalitarian form of cybernetics perhaps, and it can, but I don't know what cybernetics does for anarchism, because I think anarchism already has good critiques of hierarchy and so on.
Let me give you an example. Are you familiar with participatory economics as developed by Robin Hanel and Michael Albert?
I've heard of participatory economics, right?
Yeah. One of the things that, it's a bit weird. Again, they're trying to systematize, and they're trying to say, okay, if we don't want capitalism, we don't want a command economy, what could be an iterative planning process of how you would democratically run an economy? And they talk about different rounds of sort of planning out what you produce and how you would allocate resources and doing that kind of things. Now, they don't call it cybernetic, but the process of responding to feedback and allocation to me is quasi cybernetic in terms of planning and responding to feedback. Or maybe I don't know.
Well, again, cybernetics, totalizing discourse, you can apply any feedback system, any participatory system, you can call it cybernetic. But is it? Or is cybernetics
Like, does it need cybernetics?
It can just be feedback, right? Or participation.
I guess so. I guess my mind coming up with a sort of democratic system of planning in a top way, top bottom up fashion, would involve something that would be in the neighborhood of cybernetics, if capital C cybernetics. What do you think, Comrade Bloom?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be either safe or not safe cybernetics. But I think an important aspect is kind of being missed. And then, this comes to the point of like, Marxism and anarchism, and that's fine. But it's like a key aspect of cybernetics, particularly in its more earlier manifestations, or at least attempts as Stephen was kind of.
Can you turn the volume up?
Being able to work with teams, right?
Sorry, I just asked Stephen to turn the volume up a bit because I can't hear you.
Yeah, just turn the volume up. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Like, it's being able, or it's one method, and I don't think cybernetics is necessarily the best one for this, but being able to differentiate between work regimes, which includes jobs and informal and formal processes of economic and social reproduction, and the essential labor necessary to reproduce an economy and society at a given time, right? And I think that in that way, we do need to have something, right, that actually allows us to understand, okay, what is it that we need to run our electricity with, right? What is it that we need to run our healthcare? And cybernetics, I think, even if it's an imperfect means, was an attempt to create some kind of systemic way of separating kind of work from labor, so that we could actually then better understand, right, well, if we have to do this labor, who should do this labor, how should this labor be done, and what is the best ways in which we can do this labor efficiently, so that, you know, we're able to do exactly what I think, Rhiannon, you've been kind of talking about. You can have this kind of tacit knowledge, but also one that integrates people's desires and things like that. And I think, you know, there are difficult conversations that are going on in terms of things like, okay, if you had a commons-based agriculture, right, what is the ways in which you could use the various types of robotics and things to simultaneously ensure that we have sustainable food, while at the same time, you know, not increasing work intensification, because, you know, you don't want to have this at a massive kind of plantation level that we do now, right? So I just think that, like, I apologize because I love everything, and, you know, like, I'm very much like loving what you guys are saying, but I don't want to be the kind of boring Marxist who also says, like, there is labor that we need to understand that we need, and we need to understand what that labor is and be able to plan for it in a way that takes into account the types of work regimes that actually fulfills the kind of anarchist principles that I think both of you are really strongly talking about.
Thanks, but I don't think you're being a boring Marxist, but I think that maybe what Marx said or didn't say, or Marxists did or didn't say about planned economies and the nature of work, which is partly why I'm a bit sceptical of cybernetics, is the idea of the signal. Like, who decides on what is the value in an economy, and how is that collectively derived, and how is that done communally, which is really difficult to know. And cybernetic systems are just based on, originally just on one signal. So what is the signal that goes through the system, and how is that maximised, and how do feedback loops work, etc., etc., etc. So the problem with applying that, and cybernetics was applied to Soviet economics, etc., and planning,
For sure.
is all of the reasons we know why those systems didn't work, because it fetishized the idea of labour in a state capitalist way rather than in some of the ways that Marx talked about in terms of a critique of labour and a critique of labour power, to say, you know, how do we determine what we do with our lives? And I think that's possibly what we're getting at in a more autonomous Marxist kind of critique of cybernetics. Now maybe what we've written about is not the way to run an economy where everyone gets fed, right? Okay, right, but you know, but
well,
that's not what we're like that. Yeah.
I wonder, and this is just something that, like, I'd be into what you think, John, and Rhiannon, you would come in on this, is that I know in kind of a parallel fashion, I think you've done really good work that almost tells a counter history, and I know there's a lot of been doing things on people. I like the Rand Corporation, and then later, I mean, you know, right before the Thatcher government came in, they really, really mapped it out. Like, you know, I mean, you know, I think, what was it, in 1978? I mean, the UK government wasn't the first who did it, but they were like, if bus drivers went on general strike, this is how long we can last. And so I do think that it's an interesting kind of parallel to try to understand what that relationship is and how we incorporate, I think, the kind of foundational principles you're talking about into these types of things, about really trying to get, like, well then, you know, what would an anarchist, an anarcho-communist, autonomous Marxist mapping look like? Because we know what the Rand Corporation, we know, like, the pre-Thatcher, we know what in many ways things that, like, Lockheed Martin and McKinsey are doing now that are still classified did. But what would our version of that look like? And I don't think it necessarily has to be cybernetics, but I do think this idea of, you know, thinking through this and thinking then how the role of the factory and the moving way factories are moving now. I mean, like, what is a factory in terms of the factory? Like, if you're having a decentralized robot working alongside, helping to, you know, pick cotton, right? I mean, it sounds strange what I'm saying, but they're actually doing this mapping now, right? So it is something that maybe I'd just be interested in what you said, because I know, John, you have done really serious historical research on this, and it's not conspiracy theory. I mean, like, what was in the mid-60s, the Rand Corporation started doing this type of stuff.
Yeah, and you've looked at this in the book, haven't you? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose what I'd say to Pete, what Peter's saying now is the idea that sort of capitalism works and anarchism wouldn't or doesn't, or anarchism without
I don't think
cybernetic.
capitalism works. I think it's quite common. It's so completely inefficient.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking like there's huge. There's obviously huge swathes of people it doesn't work for who are, and huge parts of the economy occur informally or through mutual aid or through things that aren't monetized or mapped in any way, and that's why they're effective and that's why they work and that's why capitalism keeps going, because people are doing these things. And I suppose that's one of the things we're talking about in terms of tacit knowledge and hobbying, is the kind of messiness and patches that people put in place that can't be mapped, that are kind of keeping the whole system going. And that can go beyond knowledge production in the factory, and you can talk about, for example, anarchists organising food distribution or anarchists organising sort of squatting at I've just been involved in a fundraiser for the autonomous winter shelter that houses loads of people over the winter, for example. But it's not just people that are doing that. I suppose what I feel is original in terms of what I've done before in the book is that we're not just looking at people that are consciously doing anarchism. We're looking at the kind of things that happen in a factory that aren't part of capitalism, and they're not part of, I guess they can't be mapped. They're spontaneous forms of knowledge that are sort of, in a sense, propping the whole thing up, but also transgressing it at the same time and perhaps prefiguring something different. If that makes sense.
No, right now. I mean, I think it's a broader conversation, but I think it's an important one to have. Because I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I mean, I don't think trying to better understand through these processes what people need, how they need it, and what are the types of tacit relationships that are necessary for them, and also about how that relates to the fact of and again, the things are how can we then use that to reduce the amount of labor involved in providing these types of things? So I think you're absolutely right. I just think I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? These are knowledge creation that you can share and help us better understand the true economy versus the exploitative, extractive economy.
But there's something interesting. Thinking again here about the idea that there's forms of tacit knowledge that can't be mapped. Now, I understand saying that perhaps in a very formal sense, but there are means where tacit knowledges are reproduced. So, for instance, if you work in a factory, someone Paul used to said, "Hey, buddy, here's how we work. Here's the rhythms. Here's the things you know." Those informal knowledges are passed on maybe in a lumpy oil and water kind of way. So maybe there are other forms of knowledge reproduction which aren't systematized or easily mappable, but they do nevertheless happen somehow.
Sure, like work cultures, work routines, that kind of informal knowledge that's passed on. I think one of the best metaphors about tacit knowledge was that it'd be really difficult for getting a robot to ride a bike is really difficult. But humans can ride bikes, sure. But asking a human to ride a bike on the moon would be quite possible for a human to do. But translating that knowledge for a robot would be really difficult. So tacit knowledge is also really flexible and really translational. And I think that's also true of what happens in workplaces and elsewhere. But also there's a kind of idiosyncratic stuff that happens in workplaces that appears to be not necessarily resistant, but not entirely useless either. So sociologists have written about humour at work, for example, as something that's not resistant. You might see it as being compliant and gossip and things like that, which, are those sorts of, what are those things in workplaces? They can't be mapped necessarily, and they're a bit out of control in a good way, but
I suppose they're representative. I mean, people have psychoanalytic urges and things, and some of those are going to be resistant against any type of system. So you can have a perfectly mapped out system, but people are gonna, unless you see people as compliant in essentially compliant to a system, then there's always going to be parts of what it is to be a sort of feeling, desiring, affective being that will transgress that. And I suppose it's whether we value those and consider them in our understanding of what a sort of decent and ethical human system would look like, or whether we think those ought to be ultimately repressed because they're not useful to the system.
I guess I think with that, and this is just going a totally different direction. But I remember once where Sun Ra said something like, "If someone hits a wrong note, then we all hit the wrong note. Then it becomes the right note." Maybe it's a question of how interacting people in a sort of cooperative arrangement or system find ways to do that isn't it sort of an imposition or sort of get rid of the wrong desire, but more how do you sort of engage with it?
I mean, I think it's going to depend on the people involved more than it depends on whatever system you try to impose on them or get them to play by, or whatever rule book they've got. You know, it's like I've been involved in lots of kind of anarchist groups or whatever, and I've been in lots of workplaces, and what seems to matter most about whether it works or not is whether the people get on quite an essential sense, you know, and I think that possibly is a form of tacit knowledge, you know, whether you are able to get on with the people you're around and agree and you like them enough to compromise or whatever.
And cybernetics doesn't have the language to describe that. I mean, it talks about feedback and systems and, you know, different metaphors from electronics and thermostats and stuff, but that's a limited lexicon to describe what might happen in real life societies.
Well, maybe that's the kind of problem you almost were starting with. We're talking about, like, you're talking about people in social interactions, but you're talking about this with engineers and sort of like
Yeah, this whole book is probably based on some kind of confused, repressed desires that burst out of this cybernetic atmosphere.
We felt like we couldn't be engineers in the project, so we critique the hell out of real stuff.
No, I mean that's why it would be interesting to hear sort of what the people from IEM thought. They didn't tell you, but it'd be interesting to see because they're getting a different view on their everyday that they're not used to seeing, I'm guessing.
I did send them a report actually, and I was hoping to hear back from them, and I didn't. And then I don't know, maybe they emailed. Then COVID happened as well. And I think the whole factory shut down, and then I moved away from Essex. So it would be great to hear from them actually. But
yeah, I mean, we sent Cyber 4.0 the chapter, didn't we? And they had a look at it, but they didn't give us any feedback at all. No. They just rubber stamped it, which was what we wanted. So really, so.
And was there any interesting feedback is an interesting word to use here. Was there any
fall into the trap?
Was there any human response from the hack lab? Sorry, not the hack lab.
The hack space.
The people from the hack space.
Yeah, I spoke to 3 people. They didn't want a report. I mean, like, I offered each group a report, but the hack lab people weren't organised enough to decide if they wanted a report, and it was.
That's there's anarchism in action.
Yeah. Yeah. No, with that, I just spoke to sort of 3 people almost as individuals who are hobbyists who use the space rather than the place as an organisation. So I did send them their transcripts, and I don't think they respond. I mean, interviewees never respond when you send them transcripts. People have interviewed me, and I've not responded. Yeah.
I think as well we come to the conclusion that factories are more ubiquitous in capitalism than some social theorists would like to think. So we talk about Hart and Negri and biopolitical production, but we talk about within that our little factory systems happening all the time, whether it's education or public transport, whatever it might be. So the factory does seem to be a kind of current dystopia for what's happening, and certainly logistics is one of the biggest jobs at the moment. That's very done by, you know, mechanical processes treating people like cogs in the machine. So there's a lot of dystopia at the moment.
James has got his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. James!
Hello. Yeah, so I guess I've got a question. I think it relates to what Rhi was saying about, like, cybernetic systems not being able to incorporate, like, repressed desire and this kind of stuff. And I guess, so, like, my understanding of cybernetics is that it's like a set of, like, concepts and tools and methodologies and models that can, like, help to understand certain systems. Maybe you don't like that word, but, like, like complex sets of things, well, I would call a system. It's like, a set of concepts and models and tools that can help to like understand and do, like solve certain types of problems in those kinds of environments. That's what I would see cybernetics as. And you guys have like referred to like cybernetic organizations and non-cybernetic organizations a few times, and I guess like I don't really understand what you mean by that. So I think cybernetics is like a way of interpreting types of systems or organizations. You could do like a cybernetic analysis, or you could use cybernetic tools to try and understand different aspects of an anarchist organization. So I guess my question would be like, what is the difference in your reading between a cybernetic organization and a non-cybernetic organization?
I think that organisations are always in a state of tension between organisation and disorganisation, and there's capacities that can't be systematised. That would be my sense of things. I think cybernetics is an elastic set of tools, so it's possible to apply cybernetics to just about anything. That doesn't mean that it's the correct tool to use because of the messiness we've described, I suppose.
Which I think you also tend to valorise, James. So like, I really like your work, and then I like what you valorise in your work, but I think that what you valorise in your work is the things that we also valorise that transgress cybernetics in a sense. So you talk about sort of messiness and patches. So it's kind of partly when systems fail, I feel that these tendencies might come out, which are expressive, creative, and whatever. And I suppose you could map them in retrospect, but then what would you use that mapping for? Would it be to then replicate them in a future society, I'm not sure what the purpose of mapping everything would be.
One thing though, psychoanalysts have used cybernetics, haven't they, to map different aspects of the psyche, ego and id and things, but that probably doesn't count as the sort of psychoanalytic idea of design in the same way, right?
Well, if I remember correctly, it was Deleuze and Guattari who said, like, the unconscious isn't a theatre, it's a factory.
Okay, right, yeah.
That's a brilliant quote. We should have used that in the book if we'd have known.
We should. But James, what do you think?
I think like, if cybernetics is a set of tools that help to like map things, firstly, I guess I would ask, is there value in your mind of like mapping things? Because to me, that's obviously helpful to understand certain types of problems. So I don't know if you're like against mapping generally, but and I think like relating to what you've both been saying about like its inability to account for like repressed desires or whatever is outside of the system. I think if you're trying to map a system or model a system and understand it, then it's always an imperfect model, it's always an imperfect mapping, and the system's like actual dynamics do always exceed the mapping that you have. But most cybernetics, like a lot of cybernetic models, are like account for that, and the idea is to like continually move the goalposts, if you like, or change your mapping to account for those the new stuff that emerges out of the system. So like with your example of a company that makes whatever, and then suddenly one day one of the workers decides to make a duck out of bread, or whatever the example was. If the organisation decided to start making like, I don't know, playing cards and also ducks made out of bread, then you could draw new maps of like you could understand the organisation in those terms and change the mapping you have of that organisation in those terms. So I'd say that yes, I am fundamentally against that type of mapping, and I think like James Scott, the anthropologist, talks about it in terms of legibility, and legibility is kind of
very much the logic of the state. It is what the state is, and what it's defined at is the urge to map things in order to have an oversight and control them. And I can't understand why you'd want to map things on that level unless you had somebody who wanted to have an oversight and control, if you see what I mean. So by valorizing things that can't be mapped in that way. But I wrote a paper once on sort of critical cartography. So there's like a method of kind of mapping which is critical, which kind of subvertises or subverts existing maps, or looks at things that maps miss, or maps new things. And I suppose you could also call that a form of cybernetics, but then you just call everything cybernetics, I think.
Well, to give you an example of why you might want to do mapping, okay, let's say we're working for our imaginary automation, bread ducks, and what was the third thing we're making?
Playing cards.
Playing cards. This is a great company.
Yeah.
And let's say I'm on team. I'm going to be on team bread duck. But I have a question about playing cards. So I want to know who I ask about playing cards. Like, what I would look at a map for would be who is doing the various things. I have a question about the harder duck. I have a question about spades. Who handles spades, so I know how to find them. I mean, my understanding of a map is just to understand how things work, so you can know where to find stuff.
I suppose that comes down to like the kind of space and scale you want your ideal community to be on. So, I mean, a lot of anarchists say that, the ideal scale for something is something where everyone knows each other and what each other are doing.
And a mapping, a drawing, a representation doesn't have to be a cybernetic representation. This is back to cybernetics being a totalizing discourse. Then any representation could be cybernetic, in which case it doesn't really mean anything. So
I mean, it becomes a form of translatability that allows something to happen on a national or a global scale in a way. If cybernetics is the only way of mapping something, the point in that is the logic of the state, as James Scott calls legibility, I suppose.
We might differ in our views of representing stuff and legibility, but legibility doesn't mean cybernetics.
So, I wanted to come in quickly because I know Tony has to stand up, and I want to preempt because it's a question I would be interested in Tony being involved in, if that's right. I mean, I largely agree with what you're saying in terms of cybernetics, and I think Stephen's point about mapping captures a lot of what I think. You can have a non-cybernetic mapping that is about knowledge exchange and is about inter-community and inter-community economic planning that is, iterative, democratic, while also being, I wouldn't say controlling, but definitely decisive, What I would say, though, is that, and I would say also that things like the micro factories that you are finding that, we talk about hack space, but actually, like, stuff that's using digital fabrication right now and distributed manufacturing, like, they're not using cybernetics. And they are doing types of real democratic planning with communities. However, there's a different hegemony that's coming. And this is where I want to bring Tony into, which is user experience design, right? So if you go to a place that's like using 3D printers, for instance, right? And they're not thinking about cybernetics. I mean, they're not like, Allende in Chile back in the day, like, we're going to have this national planning thing, right? They're like, well, we're going to do this iteratively. Everything, in fact, that you're kind of saying, they seem, it would be kind of embedded, a lot of what they're doing. But the tyranny or the hegemony is, this is what users want. And they create these kind of systems and input, output, right? Based on like, well, users say they want this, and therefore we have to create this, right? And there's a whole range of both implicit, tacit, and explicit ways in which this can be used. I mean, if I was going to be not in a factory, but let's say we were in a hypothetical place that provided education, and
that's crazy, man. That's not real.
To create a platform that gets all of our ideas and ranks and rates them. right? This is not cybernetics. This is user experience. So
Yeah.
I saw Tony stand up, and he's probably gonna have something different. But I know Tony.
Can I just say something before that
That's
about?
a very different
yeah.
type of challenge, and maybe even in many ways a more insidious challenge. To the types of like cybernetic thing that I think, and cybernetic utopianism that I think you're rightfully challenging.
So one of the things, the sort of technical direction that some of the people took the project in was the idea that the product would talk back to the shop floor and change the manufacturing. So some of the people at the end up working with a cycle company and trying to record elements of the ride on the kind of sports bike, BMX type bike, and trying to optimize the user experience, but purely through recording what was happening during the ride and even the whoops and shrieks that the rider would make, etc., to then change the manufacture of the bike. And this is what Airbus do apparently with their airplanes that are planes flying and something goes wrong with it, it automatically feeds back to the production line. But this is more kind of putting the user experience into it, so it's almost like the commodity is talking back direct to the production line. And that's quite cybernetic, I suppose.
Isn't that kind of almost like the original idea of the talkative factory? Is that feedback loop?
Yeah, the chatty factory, yeah, kind of it.
But for sure, I mean, and I think this is where I want to bring it to. I think there's that part, and I think the transhuman aspect is going to make this even more telling. But I do think that there's an everyday process now in which most of us are under planned hegemony of this is what our users want. I mean, how much do we get to say that, like, well, students want this, so we have to do this now? Or, it's like, and I think this is something that is much more prevalent than the kind of right cybernetics thing. And I think you even see it in factories. So I'll bring in Tony now with that preamble.
I mean, can I just answer that slightly? Is that I suppose our argument is that cybernetics is just another form of functionalism where people perform functional roles.
It's been used for consumer behaviour a lot, right?
And it's,
So it's like Scooby Doo. You're like taking off the mask and like it's Talcott Parsons.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's no reason that our critique of cybernetics wouldn't also work as a critique of functional roles in education, like teacher and student. And
for sure, but I do think that it's important to recognize that it works, but I think that it is a different logic, and I would want us to pay attention to the fact that it's a different logic. It's not a pure functional logic in the way that cybernetics plays on, right? So, but I've given too much of a preamble. Tony, you've just written a great book about this, so.
Publisher still got it actually, but I did other things. I made some good points. I was going to talk. I just want to make 2 points really. One is sort of supporting what you're saying. I had some. They're very practical. This. I worked in Southend with a big group who were putting the Southend Smart Cities Initiative. So a digital group with Cisco being the main company putting in the system. And then a whole group of businesses, local authorities involved in setting up these systems, which was simply an IoT system. And we invited along a group of hackers who spoke a lot about hacking space. And the people who arrived from Cisco's were very similar, talking about the hackability of it and what would could emerge from this open sort of system, which turned out to be not open at all. In fact, the whole kind of meeting was great to start off with, but they gradually fizzled out when we found out really everything about this system, which was called Kinetic. Cisco's Kinetic, you can look it up. It's kind of, there was no hackability. No one could get access to it because it was a proprietary system. And so was all the links to all the lampposts and, environmental monitoring systems. Everything was closed. Even Southend Council lost control of its own parking system, which would tell them how many tourists were coming into the town because that was the parking companies got it. So IoT in that way and the hacker ethic, this doesn't seem to sort of go together very well. The other thing though I wanted, more in line with what we were talking about then, I went to see Harry Collins a number of years ago, who I think gets mentioned in your book quite a lot about tacit knowledge. I think when he was speaking about 2018, I think the book came out, Artificial Intelligence. A lot of the examples he was offering there about tacit knowledge were quite dated in terms of how computers worked around that time, and particularly how systems work. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but he draws mainly on the idea that tacit knowledge being that if the word weird is spelled wrong, i.e. the INE is the wrong way, that we tacitly know it still means weird, whereas a computer doesn't underline it, says it's wrong. And he uses those kind of examples a lot. And there was a young audience there who kind of, it was in Cambridge, who kind of took him to task a little bit by saying, really, computers are a lot more social now. There's a lot more aspects to computers rather than that sort of singular cybernetic kind of intelligence he was looking at. And he was underestimating the power of tacit to be captured in some way. And I think that's what Peter then goes on. I was always very suspicious about affective computing, which was a movement that claimed that it, would create computers that could detect emotion. In a way, there's a sort of tacit element to that, isn't there? Particularly the affective side of that. But it really going back to Colin's argument, these are mimic machines. And it doesn't really matter whether it gets it or not. The more they learn to mimic, they can start mimicking aspects of tacit knowledge. And I think possibly through user experience design, particularly prototyping systems, where you're continually, as Peter mentioned, iteratively running systems through, drawing on users' experience and putting through, you're learning more and more about those tacit things. I'm not claiming there's any sort of conscious computer system that actually understands and comprehends what that is. But it still doesn't mean it can't be mimicked and used within the system.
But then I suppose at the same time, humans are learning these technologies and they're learning the gaps where these technologies are failing or letting systems or, whatever down. And then they're like plugging those with tacit knowledge, if you see what I mean. So
one of the arguments with robots, you could never have an emotional robot because a robot can't feel emotion as a human can. But you can still have an actor, a robot looks emotional, they can still smile at you. And then so when you get a tacit feeling that the robot is being emotional.
But then you might also get a tacit knowledge that the robot's mimicking that, and then your tacit knowledge will keep up to date with the way in which you sort of cynically perhaps interact with these technologies.
I just think some of the old definitions around tacit a little bit crazy in terms
So,
of the way the systems work.
I think it might be Collins talks about social tacit knowledge, which is to do, I suppose, that might be to do with like a web of meanings. So it almost brings in a little bit of sort of semantics in terms of, a hammer as a tool, as a relation to different things. But also in terms of human civilization, and to use such a grand term, but human social networks. I mean, we have these connections, and there's a social tacit knowledge that's, I argue in my book on AI, there might become a find and replace one day for capitalism when AI can do those things which human labour can do, including, creating more value from labour power than goes into its creation, in which case capitalism might say, forget about humanity now and let's just have AI. But I suppose it's where we are on that curve. But I think social tacit knowledge is really difficult to replicate. And some of the tacit knowledges of workers we saw were almost kind of to do with embodiment and feeling, a physical feeling in the body, which would be more difficult for robots to have, or maybe
I'll take that point then, but within HCI, which is where kind of user experience model was invented, that's exactly where they're at. Body situated experience is their theory. They've gone from a cognitive model, of which you probably associate more with old cybernetic models, to an experiential model, drawing on phenomenology. Their embodied stuff is Heidegger through to
Heidegger was
so a lot of that stuff is becoming part of the theory, and why then start working down to theories within industry around what embodied experience is. So I agree with you completely in one way, you're going to capture that because there's a human element to it which just can't be understood or comprehended or become part of a kind of singular sort of consciousness crap. But there is an element of it, i.e. like the smiling robot, where someone will see, it doesn't take long to look at a smiling robot. You might know it's ridiculous, but you're still going to get a tacit feeling back around all, looking at someone smiling will make you smile. And I think a lot of capitalism and cyber capitalism plays on that lot more. I just think the tacit argument it holds up, but only to a certain extent.
When humans are completely replaced by android that is basically a replica of a human, then there'll be no such thing as tacit knowledge, but neither will be such a thing as human. But then again, they might not have a social network of semantic web of connections. But I suppose for us that would probably be quite dystopian. So
of course,
but maybe we're old romantic humanists though, but that could be the case. And Peter mentioned post-humanism.
I think there'd be an artificial version of tacit knowledge, possibly.
Yeah.
There's a good description of IoT, Internet of Things, as VR turned inside out. Quite nice.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Particularly in terms of dystopian kind of matrix type thing. Anyway.
Cool.
But I think also drawing on that, having worked in factories and things, I think one other thing to think about is how people identify, and I'd be interested, I'm really excited about the book, with working in a factory. To be honest, having worked in a lot of different jobs, man, sometimes the best thing in the world is having a really, really regulated workspace that gets me in and out. You know what I mean? Because my life isn't in a job. I remember when I used to work, and it's also interesting how I think the interview was what are we, thinking about the flexibilities of factories. If you think about, I did a lot of back-end work in restaurants for about 20 years, and we always just joke that the worst thing, the way in which we knew that we were going to have to, get rid of this manager somehow, was if they started talking about we really care about when you're washing dishes that you're happy and stuff. But it's I'm the slave, but it's fuck off. I want to come in, I want to work my 5 hours. I want to smoke my joint, put in my punk music, wash the dishes, and get out. And I say that because I totally understand there was a lot of passive knowledge, that you use, and that was part, but it was also a little bit of and this is something that when you would unionize, particularly which I was part of a lot of radical unionizing, one of the biggest disjunctures that both the anarchists and Marxists shared is that most people are I don't really identify working here. I come in, I have some friends, I've had some one-night stands, I buy my drugs in the back, and I do whatever these bourgeois people want me to do, and then I leave. And I live my life, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it. So I wonder that, not because that sounds very me, but I'm not actually. It's I'm also interested how do we integrate this in the fact that I think that a lot of people, right, would kind of want to balance the fact that if I'm going to be part of a labor regime, right. I kind of want it to be as easy and accessible and sometimes just give me something to do as possible because I don't really want to be here. And I want to make it as short as possible and as easy as possible and as non-engaged as possible. Right? It's playing a bit of devil's advocate because I agree with all you all. But it is something that I think about. Even when I worked on community gardens and things, people have stuff to do, they want to go watch football, you know what I mean? They don't want to be there all the time. So it's just something that I'd also be interested in what you think about that.
You can answer that, Tom.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's the nature of work under capitalism. People don't want, they want to go and do it and get the wage, which is why we all work, so... and anything else incidental is a bonus, but we're arguing that utopia would probably be people would want more than that from their lives.
Like making the bread ducks and floating them
Making
on
the
the
bread
lake,
ducks and floating them on the lake, potentially.
They
But we
want-
don't want
they
to
want-
describe that, but
they want bread, ducks, and roses too.
they want bread ducks and roses. Yeah.
Isn't there a danger though with that dynamic, John? Sorry, just that
Yeah, go for it.
we don't want to turn a fetishism of anarchism into a fetishism where it's like, well, you know, we're going to create a society where people spend more time at work because it's going to be a more empowering, amazing.
No. No, I don't think. But I think even for Marxists, they don't want people to spend more time at work. You know, the way that work exists in totally alienated conditions under capitalism is not what people want to be doing.
Yeah.
Marx talked about, the early Marx about what people were going to be doing with their days, and it wasn't checking into Cyber 4.0 and working on the production line. It was poetry, this sort of stuff, and yeah.
I mean, we have a list of recommendations at the back of the book, and one of them is having like a huge amount of redundancy in the system. So, I organise with an anarchist group, and we're doing a fundraiser at the weekend, and we had like 5 people for every role because we knew that some people might not come, or some people might get drunk, or some people might get involved in a conversation halfway through doing their role, and just having a huge amount of redundancy where there's, space to play with. But I mean, obviously we still had roles, and I suppose is that a cybernetic system where you map you could certainly map that with a cybernetic diagram if you wanted, but I'm not sure that would sort of capture everything that goes on.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's true, James. No, I mean, that's great. I mean, and I hope with that you announce that, you have all these redundant rules, like, at the end of meetings, because I think that's the best time to do it. So, but yeah, absolutely, that's a really good point. I mean, and you definitely see that, like, a lot of what you're talking about, like, can be solved. It's like, you recognize without cybernetics the amount of labor necessary, and then have a lot of people able to do that role and be interchangeable and have that flexibility.
That idea of redundancy is definitely not incompatible with cybernetic models of organization. I think like redundancy of potential command it is like a concept in cybernetics, like fairly early in cybernetics, from a guy called Warren McCulloch, and like Thomas Swan talks about that in his book and his PhD. So yeah, like having, like we said, like a lot of people able to do the same roles, like that kind of thing is definitely compatible with and often a part of cybernetic understandings of how to model organizations and stuff.
Cool. So I'm thinking we should probably nudge towards not because of that, but I think we should nudge towards coming to a sort of not conclusion, but a sort of pause for the evening. So maybe I'll ask just like one more thing, and then we'll sort of call it a night. Is that cool?
Yeah, cool.
Is that okay? Okay, so maybe this is a kind of cliched sort of thing, but I'm trying to think of sort of, where do you think you're going from here? Like, what's next? Is it more nuclear war, or is it
No,
just
where are you going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing about food, so I'm writing about social movements organising food, and I did some data collection in 2022, and I'm just, having just finished this, I finally got around to looking at that, and it's about mostly anarchist groups, some cooperatives and so on, doing various different things with food, like community gardens, but basically sort of production and distribution of food in mutual aid or anarchisty kind of ways, which is quite interesting. And I suppose one of the things that I've come across is that there's certain sort of choke points in the supply chain which prevent people from being able to be autonomous from capitalism, I suppose, but there's people sort of rescuing waste and growing their own food and things like that as well. So
cool.
I am writing about nuclear war.
I'm not surprised.
But actually, the link to cybernetics is FEMA, to reconstruct American capitalism, wanted people to be in their original work roles. It decided that actually the best way to get people into work, even if they were digging graves or ditches, was to say you are the professor of digging ditches and organise it along lines of whatever their work role will be, and they were using cybernetics to do that. But the other bit of interest in is positivism and positists, and I wonder if aliens are not visiting us because of our application of cybernetic systems, because they feel that's too capitalist. And if we were maybe using it in a way James would say in a more anarchist way, or Thomas Swan way, then we'd have aliens swarming our atmosphere to see our communist anarchist technologies we were using. Who knows? So.
Well, perhaps when I write my book on football and talk about Pizzata as a central defensive midfielder, we can also then consider what food system he would advocate and how it would be organised and whether it puts off the communist aliens.
I think that's a very important question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, for another day. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, and thanks
James,
y'all for coming along and having a nice
Peter
chat.
And,